Thank you for tuning in to Grieving Voices. Today, my guest is Betsy Smith, and she's going to be sharing her grieving voice today on the podcast. And I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation, Victoria. And I am a recent widow, not so recent, 4 years ago. My husband was diagnosed with bone marrow cancer in 2014, and he died in 2018. And we were in North Carolina at the time. And as a widow, one of the first things they tell you is don't make any major decisions for the first year. Well, I had sold a house, bought a house, moved within 6 months. So, and it was exactly the right thing for me. It wouldn't be the right thing for everybody. So during my husband's illness, I realized that there were a lot of people that were very intimidated by the healthcare system and the professionals. And it became my passion and my purpose to spread the word about advocacy as well as caregiving. My first career was with a huge community college in Pensacola, Florida. I was the dean, I was a provost, I was a vice president. Then I opened my own consulting business. And my business is, the overlying theme is advocacy. The leader is advocate, patient advocacy, of course, and self-advocacy for women in the workforce.
So it's almost as if that you were built for this work.
Yes, I think, I can remember, or maybe it's family folklore, when my mother brought my baby sister home. She's 5 years younger than me. And my memory says, my mother said to me, Betsy, you're the big sister, and you've got to take care of Molly now. And I took that very seriously. My 5-year younger sister thinks I was just bossy, but that's not true. I was her advocate.
So did you have a lot of grief experiences in your childhood that prepared you for this experience that you've had in the last 4 years?
I did not. Of course, people lived and died in my family, aunts and uncles and grandparents. But I never, and my mother and father were, my mother was in her late 60s. My father was 83 when he died. So, well, I went through 2 divorces, but that's not really grief. That's kind of annoyance.
I'm curious why you think that's not grief, or how you view it as not being grief for you, because even in less than loving relationships or loving relationships, there's conflict there, right? And so
Right.
Grief isn't necessarily sadness or depression or about loss of a loving relationship. It can be anger and frustration and disappointment and all of those other, grief is so much more than that. So I'm personally curious how your view of that and how those divorces weren't grief.
I would not have said that if I hadn't just lived through the death of a husband. That's different. In divorce, somebody chooses, and it may not be you, but somebody makes the choice. And I've always been I was a child of the 60s. I've always been very independent. And yes, the 2 divorces were game changers, absolutely. But compared to grieving over the death of a spouse, it, for me, pales in comparison.
I totally get where you're coming from. For people listening, because the premise of my message in what I share with people is that grief isn't just about loss.
No, you're right.
It's a lot of things. Yeah, you can have even moving, right? When your husband passed away and then having to move, and loss of the neighbors you had and the coworkers and colleagues and things.
right, right. And I relocated back to Pensacola, Florida, where we lived for 20 years before we moved up to North Carolina. So I came back to a loving environment. I came back to friends who've known me for 30 years. I came back to a place I knew well and that we'd had some wonderful times in.
Do you think subconsciously it was to seek out support and maybe security and
Yes,
safety in your environment? Yeah.
it absolutely was. And as I jokingly say, I have colonoscopy friends down here. I have friends I can call up and say, I have a colonoscopy scheduled next week. Can you drive me and spend 4 hours with me?
I have one of those friends because I have to have one every 5 years. So I
I
totally
do
get
too.
you. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I totally get you. So, well, I'm curious about that too. Did you obviously must have had a scare of some sort when it comes to polyps or something?
My father died of colon cancer when he was 83.
Okay.
And because of that history, um, as I got closer to 83, they shortened the time of colonoscopies. Never
Oh,
had a bad
sure.
report. I mean, a polyp or two, but I've never had any bad reports or scary reports.
My father passed away at 44
Oh my
of colon
goodness.
cancer. Yeah. And
Oh my goodness.
I had a
Yeah.
polyp removed when I was 33,
Yeah.
32. Yeah, 32, I think. So
Yeah.
yeah, every 5 years since then.
Yeah.
So with how long were you married to your husband when you found out that when he was diagnosed? How long had you been married?
We totally were together 22 years. We were married 14. So we've been married about 11 years when he was diagnosed.
Did he have a family history or was it just kind
He
of out?
did.
Okay.
His mother was a heavy smoker. She got lung cancer long before me. He and I met late in life. His father died of some form of cancer, and Jack had already survived prostate cancer, had radiation and came through that fine. And then 5 years later,
Mm. So you've actually had previous experience with the healthcare system before his second
I
diagnosis.
did in Victoria, in my tenure at the community college, I was provost of the health related campus. And we had nursing, and we had physical therapy assisting, and we had dental assisting, and we had radiology. So, and I was sent out there, not because I have a health background. I was sent out there because I am a community builder. And the president wanted that campus to become more of the community. And, I used to take hospital CEOs to lunch and ask them for $1 million for a new medical building on the campus. So those 5 years gave me lots of information about healthcare and doctors and CEOs and how they think and how that whole system works. Now that's been 20 years ago, so things have changed significantly.
What was the one takeaway what was the one thing, or maybe a few things that you disliked or that you thought could be better, or that prompted you really to write your book and to become this advocate for healthcare?
According to Johns Hopkins, there are 240,000 medical error deaths a year.
Wow.
The first incident that happened that made me realize, my husband was in a clinical trial. We were at the hospital every day. Fortunately, it wasn't very far away from us in North Carolina. And one day they said, we're going to do 2 tests today. We're going to do one up here on this floor. And then when we finish, in exactly 30 minutes, they have to start a second one down on the second floor. And the nurse said, You check out, I'll take him down there. So I checked out and it took about 30 minutes, and I went down to the appropriate waiting room and looked around. Now we're at 30 minutes. And there was Jack in a wheelchair in a corner, asleep. And I shrieked, "Why is my husband still out here?" And a tech came out. He said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, he was supposed to have had whatever it was started 5 minutes ago. And why isn't he in there?" And the tech said, "We didn't know he was here." And that's when I realized I couldn't trust the healthcare system to take care of my husband.
And what was the experience like throughout those 4 years?
We had some good experiences and we had some horrible experiences. At one time when he was in the hospital, his name tag got switched with another person's name tag on the blood vial.
Oh my.
Thank God the nurse that was checking his counts at 6 o'clock in the morning realized something was very wrong. And she went screaming down the hall in the hospital. And then there were 7 people in the room, and the phlebotomy department and the vice president of quality control. And they assured me that they had found the problem, that it would never happen again. And I wrote several memos to the hospital CEO, but this one started as a former provost of a health-related campus for over 5 years. I understand mistakes happen, but this is unacceptable. Another time, he was we were thousands of miles away from North Carolina, which we should not have been, but we were, because he wanted to go. And he was hospitalized, and I wanted him back in North Carolina. So I started a tirade to get him released. And one hospitalist told me, I'll release him to go back to North Carolina by ambulance. And I said, "You have got to be kidding me. We're not putting this man in an ambulance for 27 hours to get him back to North Carolina." And in the back of my mind, I knew if anything happened, they would stop and he would be admitted to another hospital. A week later, the same hospitalist came in. I said, "I'm going to release him to fly commercially." I said, "No, what are you thinking? He can hardly walk. His immune system, he has none. No, we're not getting on a commercial flight." And then I went to see the hospital CEO, and the hospital paid to have Jack Learjet flown in a Learjet ambulance back to North Carolina. Those are big things. And Victoria, I know not everybody has my personality. Not everybody grew up in Texas. Not everybody was provost of a health-related campus. But I wrote the book to let family members and friends understand you're not powerless. Ask the hard questions. If you don't understand what the doctor's telling you, ask them to use language you can understand. Don't be afraid to ask for a second opinion. Keep up with the meds that they're being given. And doctors and nurses and everybody else in the healthcare system are human beings. And we make mistakes, and they get tired, and they're overworked. And they have lots of patients. We have one.
Yeah, I think we give a lot of power away, especially as the family. Like you said, it's almost as if I think what happens and tell me if you think I'm wrong or share your input as well, but I've had personal experiences as recent as towards the end of this last year where my son was in and out of the hospital for something that's really rare. And, one physician saying one thing and everyone else is saying something different. And here's me like kind of being the bulldog, right?
Yes, exactly.
And annoying the piss out of everybody around me. I'm sure of it. But, he's my son, right?
Yeah,
I'm going to be his advocate. So,
yeah,
but what happens is I think just like as we medicalize dying, when
yes,
someone is on hospice or someone has cancer, but they're in the hospital, not on hospice, which is an
yeah,
entirely different
yes,
situation,
ma'am.
completely different dynamic. Please get on hospice if you can.
Yes.
That's what I would say. Um, we just leave the whole process to people we think and believe know better,
Mhm.
who know that individual better than we do.
Right.
Um, so what are your insights, that a few things that you would like to share with listeners to keep in mind if they have a loved one who has a terminal illness?
Or even just a long-term illness.
Correct. Yes.
And one is always have somebody with your patient, always. Take notes, copious notes. And if you can't, have somebody with you who can, or ask the doctor if you can record it. I doubt that would happen, but you could. I asked for Jack's medical records every day he was in the hospital so that I had them. I don't know why I thought that was important, but I thought that was important. Um, because he was in and out of hospitals so much for such a long time, we both of us got to know the custodians, the food service people, the student nurses, the residents, because those relationships make you part of that family and they know things other people might not. And when he was in the hospital for 3 weeks and I valet parked for 3 weeks, the valets and I became buddies. And when he died, and I went downstairs to get my car, and of course they could tell it had happened. And this one young Black man said, "May I pray with you?" It still brings tears to my eyes, but that meant a lot to me. A grief therapist asked me shortly after Jack died, was I afraid when he was sick? And I said, no, I was pissed. And she said, pissed at what? At him? Nope, I was just pissed. Now I can see that's how I was manifesting my grief. I just kept hammering, just kept hammering, just kept hammering. And until I got relocated and it really hit me, then I went to a grief therapist weekly to sort through that. And grief is interesting. I perceive it as, yes, they say it's like a wave will hit you. I could viscerally feel layers lift from me. Not always at the same place at the same time, but I could feel it off my shoulders for months. And I just felt lighter and lighter and more willing to go on and eager to write this book, to share with others, to, as my grief therapist said, I don't know what this looks like, but your new work is advocacy.
So what would you say changed, how you changed, like the version 2.0 of you versus who you were before? Do you think this has softened you a little?
No,
No?
no. As a matter of fact, I have a dear friend who's also a coach like I am, and she said, I perceive you lead from your head, not your heart. I said, my heart's worn out. I'll get back to that. But some people would. Some people, well, every human being reacts differently to every single thing that happens. So what we can do is tell our story through our lens, through our filter, and start the conversation. Get the conversation started.
Even though people, I mean, from what you shared, this tough exterior, right? This, bulldog mentality, like just getting in there and getting to work. Do you feel like this grief, though, has cracked you open in a way that nothing else in your life had?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you feel like you see yourself differently and others maybe differently with this lens? Maybe a lens of compassion?
Compassion, empathy, one of my purposes is to give family members and friends the courage and confidence to be that advocate. And your idea of courage and confidence is probably different than my idea of courage and confidence. I have a story in the book from a retired hospice chaplain, a female retired hospice chaplain. And we were swapping stories, and I'm telling her how I did this and how I did that. And she was telling me how she gently and persuaded people to do this and that. And it was a great conversation because that worked for her. And I tried that. I'm a Southern girl. I know how to be nice. But there comes a time when nice isn't working. So you get insistent. You get passionate. You get assertive. And sometimes I cross the line over into aggressive. And I love your term, bulldog. That's what an advocate is. Whether you're advocating for a political policy, whether you're advocating to get a new neighborhood built, a new park built, you got to stay with it. You stay with it. It's not for the faint of heart.
I think that's with anything in life that we're passionate about, right? To be a bulldog, to pursue it with a bulldog mentality. For me, grief isn't just about loss, and that's a big part of my message. It's
Yes.
I want people to see themselves in the stories that people share and understand that someone doesn't have to die for you to experience all the feelings that come along with grief.
And I have that just brought to mind another experience I had. I worked for the same man at a community college for almost 20 years. And he got liver cancer and he died in 6 months. I competed for the presidency of the college against another internal candidate. There were only the two of us. And the 6'2", 55-year-old white boy that used to play football at Florida got the presidency. And immediately started taking pieces of my job away from me. That was a time, Victoria, when I was hit with grief as well, because I loved working at that college. I loved doing what I did. I was well respected, and to be treated, and he wasn't forthcoming with it. It was like, I was on a 3-year revolving contract. When I got my contract, it was for 2 years.
Mm.
And I went up to his office and said, "Tom, what's this about?" And he said, "Well, didn't we talk about this?" No, we didn't talk about this. So I handled that grief by requesting that the board buy out my contract so that I could leave and get out from under him, because it wasn't good for me. It wasn't good for him. It wasn't good for the students. And they did that. And then that's when I started my coaching business.
And I'm glad you went there because toxic work environments is a real thing.
Yeah.
And especially for women, I think in industries or in careers that are generally male dominated or masculinely dominated.
Mhm.
Um, so what do you share? Can you share a few tips for those who may feel marginalized or discounted or, almost like they're pushed out?
I, in the last couple of years, have created what I call Betsy's rules. And I didn't sit down to write them. I'll send you a copy. I didn't sit down to write them. It's just that every day something would come to me. At that time, I was going to the gym 3 days a week and working with a trainer. And I'd say, I came up with a new rule. And they'd say, oh, yeah, here's another. So the first rule is for women in the workforce, you get to choose. You get to choose whether you stay. You get to choose whether you ask for the raise. You get to choose if you want to go. The second one is stop apologizing. Because as long as you are apologizing, people will make you responsible for the mistake. And as you know, women are the worst about, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but do you have a minute? I know this may sound silly, but, and so stop apologizing. Another one is sit at the table. Another one is when you introduce yourself, stand up and speak up. So they're just little snippets of things I learned over the years building my career. I learned to play golf because I got tired of being left out when the boys would go play golf. And I wasn't very good at it, but I had a good time. And they were okay with it as well.
Yeah, I think it's just exposing yourself to those different situations and experiences that just really help make you be a little bit maybe a more well-rounded in
Yeah,
those environments to when it comes to time to speak up for yourself.
yeah.
And so was that something that was emulated for you as you grew up?
Well, I lived in Texas when Ann Richards was the governor. And Ann was, at least to say, a tough old cookie. She used, this is not a political statement, but she used to refer to George W. as Shrub because they were both in politics in Texas at the same time. She was a front runner. I mean, she made history. Not everybody didn't like that history, but that's okay with me. I learned, I can't remember when, that, and one of my rules is, why do you care what anybody thinks about you?
Was your mother that type of person though? Was your mother someone that spoke up for herself and
She
asserted
did.
herself when she had to?
She did. Now, my mother was 4'11". I think she weighed 120 pounds when I was born. Square-jawed German, just like me. And you're right, she stood up for what she believed in. Never worked outside the home a day in her life, so I give that caveat because she didn't have a lot to lose. I was 5 years older than my sister, so by the time my sister got in high school, I was gone. It was the day of mini skirts. My sister and two of her friends went to high school with their mini skirts, and the principal sent them home. And my mother was the only one home, so they went to our house. And my mother dressed those three girls in my old prom dresses that were what we used to call T-length. That was between your knee and your ankle. Took them back to the high school, marched them up to the principal's office, looked at the principal and said, nobody tells my girls how to dress. Go to class, girls. And they did. Now, I tell that story and some people are horrified because it was so disrespectful. Other people say, she was a feisty little woman, wasn't she? Yeah, she was, especially when it came to her kids.
Yeah, I think of people like generally, this might be a generalization, but often people who are advocates are like social workers and, the bulldogs of our culture are in those types of roles. Are
Yep.
those often the people that are drawn to you, or what type of people are generally drawn to your consulting?
Um, primarily 99% of the clients that I have or the groups that I run are either executive and professional women or business women. And I have a speech that I start with that says, do you know why women don't get the raises? They don't ask.
Probably true.
Yeah.
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 I think that has a lot to do with self-worth, right? Like not feeling you're worthy.
Or that they'll know I'm doing a good job. They'll recognize it. No. And they may recognize it. And until you ask for extra compensation, they will never think about giving it to you. I had a mentor group in North Carolina of 4 young professional women who worked in the pharmaceutical companies. And one of them wanted a promotion to a position that had become vacant. So we coached her on how to do that. Get all your success points together. Is this the right time in your company's financial history to ask for it? What's going on in your company? So we got all that. And then I said to her, are you ready to walk? And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, when you ask for this promotion, are you ready to walk? And that's what Sheryl Sandberg wrote in Lean In. You got to be ready to walk. So this young woman goes to her boss and says, I'd like this promotion. Here's what I've done. Here's what I can contribute. And he said, well, let me think about it, of course. He comes back the next day and he said, I'll change your title and let you go ahead and take the job, but let's wait 6 months to see about the money. She had another job 3 weeks later because she was already getting ready to walk.
I think this is such a great, I'm glad the conversation went here because it's something that hasn't been talked about on this podcast yet. This type of grief that many women in these environments experience. And, it has ripple effects, right? Because if we are not forced, but, we want to stay true to ourselves, it may require change. And that with that change comes, new bosses, new colleagues, you might have to move.
Sorry.
You might have to move. And so all of our choices, right, have ripple effects and consequences and things. I do want to circle back to your husband though, because that really is, the heart of what we were initially talking about. And what would you share with people who have someone who is going through a similar situation? And I know you like the tangible, not the tangible, but the practical things that you've already shared. But as far as how to what is the hardest thing you think that is for people to navigate in the healthcare system?
Well, I think the entire language of the healthcare system is foreign to us. And every drug has at least 2 or 3 names. At one time, Jack had a cardiologist, a pulmonologist, a endocrinologist, and they were all treating their disease. They weren't treating the person. And the sooner you can understand that, the sooner you can say, okay, so how does that relate to this? Or if that happens, how's it going to affect his AFib? Or how's it going to affect his whatever. Medical professionals, they read notes. They all have copious notes. I can't imagine how they could read all of them and remember all of them. And I suspect they don't. But again, they're human beings. And that's why it's important to have, well, an advocate by your side. And even in business, if you want to go up the corporate ladder, you want to find an advocate, you want to find a mentor, and you want to find a sponsor. And the advocate can tell your story. The mentor can help you develop a strategy, but the sponsor is the one who will get you into the right place at the right time. The sponsor is the one who works at the same company, who provides you the opportunity to get to know people at a different level.
The connector.
A connector. Yep.
What is the one thing that your grief has taught you?
To be humble. To enjoy every second of every day, and to, you don't ever get over grief. You just, by God, live through it. And even a couple of weeks ago, I was giving my speech and tears were just rolling down my cheeks. I hadn't cried in weeks, and you just never know. And I said to the people in the audience, it's part of the process. I've never been a crier in my life, but when it happens now, I just wipe my eyes and say it's part of the process. And early, when you meet people after your husband dies, and they'll say, they'll hug your neck and say, how you doing? And the tears will start, and they'll say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you cry. You didn't make me cry. I cried. It's part of the process. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, the tears were already in there, right? It's
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
Love can bring that out, right? And that's a good thing. You know,
Yes,
when you feel love and
absolutely.
support from others, it's a good thing.
Absolutely.
I had a question around that. Oh, because again, you can have this bulldog mentality and this approach to life, but you also asked for help and you
Yes.
searched for help. And I really want to highlight that, because what do you think was the catalyst for that? Because so many grievers do grieve alone and think they need to do it alone.
I know, and because I have a counseling degree and I am a certified coach, I feel like if I have tonsillitis, I go to the doctor. If my heart hurts, I go to a counselor.
Mm.
So I don't, and I'm, as you can tell, I'm an extrovert off the chart. So I don't understand grieving alone. And of course, now friends will say, oh, my nephew died and my sister's really not getting over it well. And I'll say, did she see a grief therapist? No, she doesn't. She doesn't want to. And then I go into how it helped me. And just to have that safe place where you can say things you can't say to anybody else. To have someone say, I don't know what it looks like, but advocacy is your new work. It's a different level of, well, dogs, phones. It's a different level of work.
Well, and I think to have someone that can reflect back to you what you don't see yourself
Yes.
is a healthy part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm doing some research. I contacted a friend in North Carolina and said, I've written this book. I'd like to be on your radio show. And her radio show is about business, small business. And she said, how does that fit in with business? So I did some research on the economic impact of caregiving on business. And very soon, people the age of 65 there will be more of us than there are people 45. And it's affecting business. Some caregivers won't tell their employer. I mean, they're just running themselves ragged. And the typical caregiver is a 49-year-old woman working full time and taking care of a parent or a child or somebody.
Or both.
Or
That
both.
sandwich generation, they call it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there is an economic cost to grief. Empathy, the company Empathy, they have an empathy app, it's called. They recently published a study, and I'll put it in the show notes. It's an ebook, and it has a lot of statistics and things. But also the Grief Recovery Institute, through which I am a certified grief recovery method specialist, also did a study years ago on the economic impact of grief. And it is crazy. I can actually include that in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
It's the Grief Index study. And it truly is something that business, corporate world, they don't consider how unproductive people can be when they're grieving, and how unsupportive their company really is to those grieving. I mean, they expect you within a week to be back in your typical self and performing at how you were before.
Yeah.
And so you had your own business, right, at the time?
Yes, I did.
And so what was that impact for you?
Oh, my business shut down. There was not enough of me to run a business and be by his side. I'm building it back now.
And there's grief in that too, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
It's never just one thing. It's always grief, just has ripples. And we just do not understand that until we're in the thick of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
What has been the greatest help for you then as you're rebuilding your life?
The book. The book, it is making a difference in people's lives. And was my intention. My intention also, Victoria, is to approach businesses and say, very probably you have this many people who are caregivers, and bring me in a couple times a month, get us together, and let me debrief them and work with them so they can regain their productivity. Or let me work with people who are grieving, although that's not my specialty, because I've been through it. I can at least have a conversation about it and possibly refer. But you're right. And I predict that elder care, just like maternity leave, I think you're going to see, I don't know what they're going to call it, caregiving leave or elder care leave or something, to give people the opportunity to go attend to that and know that their position is safe.
That's a great tip. Actually, do you have a tip to share for caregivers? Like, what is one thing that you would share with caregivers that you learned from your experience that maybe surprised you?
One thing is that I could give my husband shots in his stomach. That was a pretty big surprise to me, but you have to do it. I'm going to give you tips, and they are tips. Self-care before care of others. Eat well, rest, exercise, talk to friends. Forgive yourself for not being superhuman. Share with other people what you're going through, because they may learn from it. and they may have tips or advice for you. Now, I have a dear friend down here who's her sister just died, and her husband has been in congestive heart failure for a long time. She's very private. I would keep up with her because I had been where she was with a sick person, but she didn't stay in touch with very many people, and it will be interesting, and I will be here to help her get back into whatever her new normal is going to be.
I like that. I had another question or a thought, and it just went.
The other thing is maintain your sense of humor, which it sounds strange, but when we were in that little tiny town in the middle of Texas, his 4 adult children and me, we would just get hysterical over dinner, over nothing. But it was a bonding, and fortunately, my husband's family and my family share that laughter is the best medicine. My mother's mantra was, you might as well laugh as cry. So find something funny and allow yourself to laugh. Laughing is like exercise for your innards.
That's a great tip. Would you like to share about your husband, who he was, what you loved about him?
As my sister said, he's the smartest person she ever met. And I said, hello, I have a PhD, but he was brilliant. Give him an Excel spreadsheet, he was a happy man. He found tennis very late in life. So he played tennis 3 times a week with people a third of his age. He loved being with me when I presented. And I have another book that I co-authored 10 years ago, and he'd go to the book signings and he'd take care of all the finances. Unique sense of humor. We just hit it off, but we were late in life. I was almost 50 and he was almost 60 when we, as we say, started hanging out together. So we came at love and marriage from a different perspective than a 40-year-old would.
Yeah, I think you kind of cut the BS at that point, right?
Yeah, exactly. There was not much dancing around. It was,
cut to the chase, right?
Yeah.
What was his name?
Jack.
What is his name? Jack.
Jack Harkin.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Is there anything else you'd like to share that you didn't get to?
No, I'm good. We had a very interesting conversation. I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of good ground for a lot.
We did. And like you said, we kind of weaved around and intertwined, and it was very enjoyable for me. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here. And where can people find you and the book?
The book is on Amazon, $15, and then there is a Kindle edition as well on Amazon. And I do work with families and friends of people individually or in groups, not to teach them how to handle the Medicare papers, but just to talk about strategies for dealing with the healthcare system.
Do you do that online or in person?
Either way, online, in person, on the phone, however they need to reach out.
And where can people find you to learn more about that?
Look at betsysmith.com.
All right. And I will put your information in the show notes.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being here today. I'm really glad a lot of the topics came up because, like I said, they haven't been covered yet on the podcast. And I really appreciate your time and sharing today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
All right. And remember, when you unleash your heart, you unleash your life. Much love.